Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this morning to this event, which is jointly sponsored by the Oxford Martin School and Oxford's Institute for Ethics in AI. I'm John Tasioulas. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. I'm delighted to welcome our main speaker today, Professor Daron Acemoglu. Daron is Institute Professor at MIT, and we have the great good fortune to have him in Oxford this term as the Sanjaya Lal Visiting Professor. And we're also honored to welcome Mrs. Rani Lal, who is with us today. Daron, as you know, is one of the world's leading economists and a leading public intellectual, having been voted by Prospect Magazine's top thinker of 2024, so he can actually prove he's the leading public intellectual. At the Institute, we are especially happy to co-host this event because Daron has been a highly valued, distinguished research fellow with us for some years now. Although I noticed you only became top thinker after joining Oxford, so a mere coincidence? Modesty forbids me speculating on that. What we especially love about Daron's work is that he does economics with a human face, if I can put it like that, emphasizing that ultimately all economic and other institutional arrangements have to be judged at the bar of human flourishing. His recent book with Simon Johnson, entitled Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, is a brilliant example of this humanistic approach. Drawing on salient historical illustrations and engaging extensively with the contemporary AI revolution, the book emphasizes the importance of human agency. Among its themes, that the development and deployment of technological advances is not an inexorable process, but one everywhere dependent on human choices. That whether these new technologies like AI will advance shared prosperity depends on those choices and who gets to make them. That greater democratic control is needed for technology to serve valuable ends and for its benefits to be fairly distributed. That work itself is not simply instrumentally valuable as a means to an income, but has great intrinsic worth as the expression of agency, skill, and as a source of democratic self-esteem. In the now crowded and often hype-driven field of AI policy, the book is a powerful articulation of a humanistic democratic vision that mounts a frontal attack on the dominant vision, as Daron sees it, among tech leaders. That's a vision that's focused on automation, replacing human endeavor rather than enhancing human capabilities, surveillance, and mass data collection. A vision inimical to democracy, shared prosperity, and human flourishing generally. So for these reasons and more, I'm honored to welcome Daron to give us his lecture today on redesigning AI for better work, human agency, and democracy. Daron.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a true honor to be here, partly because this is a fantastic crowd and it's a really excellent topic for me to sort of share my thinking with you, but also because, John was extremely nice on, my book with Simon Johnson. But what I want to do is actually push it further, partly based on things I have learned from people in this room about how we can bring more of a focus on human flourishing and what the threats to it are in the age of AI. And if so, are there ways of rethinking AI and what we want from it, how to design it, how to choose its architecture to do it better for that purpose of human flourishing. And in fact, I'm going to start very much where John was already what John was already talking about, that human flourishing, I think, is a very natural objective, and I think I have nothing to add to the excellent work that people like John and others in this room have done. I'm their student on this. But I would add something that's obvious in a lot of this writing, that human agency is critical to flourishing, meaning that the capacity to make decisions, shape one's own destiny, and make things, interact with the real world, which most of us do in the context of work. I don't think we can have just health, comfort, prosperity in terms of what we consume, and that's not going to be enough for human flourishing. We need these higher order achievements, purpose, meaning, and I don't think you can get them just by, playing video games, and I'm not against video games. You won't get them just reading Marcel Proust either. So I think you do need to interact with the real world and do something, and I think that's part of work. So that's the normative case for human agency within this human flourishing thing. There are two other positive cases, or one of them is definitely positive, the other one is semi-normative. One is for actually improving our collective capabilities, for example, prosperity. The way that humans learn and do better things is very much built on human agency. So in particular, we discover things which most of the time is done in interaction with the real world, whether you're an artisan or a scientist, and then we share them collectively. So human agency, therefore, is critically a very important part of our collective improvements in our knowledge and therefore ability to produce more, to create better lives and so on. And also democracy is both necessary and a mechanism for elevating human agency. Meaning that I think unless people also exercise the same collective input into shaping their broader political and social environment, I think human agency will be only limited. I can do work, I can read Marcel Proust, I can play video games, but I have no say on the type of society I live in, and I think that would be constraining to human agency. And then once you actually have people participate in collective decision-making, I think that really elevates their understanding and their purposefulness. So I think this is actually fairly well understood, at least the sort of the positive empirical case is fairly well understood in anthropology and biology. So what we know from small-scale societies that have been studied is that there is a very strong structure of individuals discovering things and learning from each other. And that's one of the main reasons why size of small-scale societies has been so important for the types of economic, technological, and other social arrangements that they have developed. So for example, from one of those papers, here is the size of different small-scale societies in a binned form. And on the left, on the vertical axis, we have the number of tools. And on the right, the complexity of the tools that they have developed. And in both cases, you see that bigger means more complex and more tools. And I think the most likely explanation, which seems to fit a lot of the other facts, is that bigger groups do different things, experiment differently, and then they share that knowledge collectively, which leads to these tool making and more complexity emerging among them. Now, in fact, I would go further and I would say that collective learning is indeed an integral part of what makes us human. Again, there is evidence on this from biologists and social psychologists. One nice set of experiments is not unique to this paper, but I just showed you these very nice figures from a relatively recent paper. And if you compare humans to chimpanzees, actually humans are not that much better early on, especially before they have done that sort of collective learning in spatial tasks. That's why you may have seen videos of chimpanzees very quickly sorting things very, very successfully. What really distinguishes humans from chimpanzees, and that's why over time they get much better in all sorts of things, is collective learning. From a very early age, about 2, humans have a much greater ability to learn socially. They understand that they have to imitate others. They have many different approaches for that imitation, and they have instinctive ways of trying to find who is the best person to imitate. So that's the way in which we essentially discover things and we share it socially. But how can we discover things if we all do the same thing? Now, that's why human agency is not just about doing things, but it's also doing things in our own ways. You know, it wouldn't be human agency if Josh, Katya, John, all of us, we have to do exactly the same thing, like in North Korea. This is North Korean children learning how to be, and its uniformity is very important. I think there are many, all of these things in history are overdetermined, but reasonable accounts suggest that at least a very important part of the big decline in the Arab world, sometime around the late 12th century, early 13th century, is very much about much lower amount of variety of things that people are doing, much greater uniformity, arguably perhaps the same thing after the Ming Dynasty in China. So human agency, therefore, is not just doing things and shaping things around you, but doing it in your own way, according to the variety and the comparative advantage, perspectives, preferences, and information of different individuals. Now, the talk that I'm going to give is based on the following premise, that this approach to human agency plus collective learning, which is our way of improving our knowledge, improving our understanding, our interaction with the natural world, and also a major component to human flourishing, is under threat, under two threats that are very, very tightly connected, but they are two different threats. But one perhaps comes from the other. We can talk about that. And I would say that we have to understand what these threats are in order to develop our view of what we want from AI and a roadmap for getting there. So the first one is that from a very different corner, which is completely distinct from North Korea, the Arab world, or the Chinese world, a one-dimensional view of human talent has emerged over the last half century. One that ranks individual on a single dimension. One of the most extreme forms, for example, is Hertog and Murray's book, where there are intelligent people are ranked above it, and intelligent people can do everything that lower intelligence people can do. That contrasts to views, for example, by social psychologists like Howard Gardner, multiple intelligences, multiple skills. Some people are better at visual, some people are better at emotional, some people are better at that manual interacting with the real world, like the artisanal skills. But I would say we are losing that because society has started valuing and furthering the self-reproduction of a very one-dimensional view of talent, both related to analytical skills, things that you generally measure in IQ tests, but also very much associated with these great learning institutions such as mine, such as Oxford, where we actually teach people that, and they are supposed to be at the very top of this one-dimensional ranking, if such a one-dimensional ranking exists. The second one is that AI on its current path is also going there. And both of these, I think, are threats to the type of collective human flourishing that I've outlined, because they reduce the human agency to one set of people or one set of technologies are going to do it, and the rest of us don't need to do it. So we don't need to, my skills, my learning as a manual worker is less valuable. Your skill as a human is less valuable because AI is going to teach you how to do it. AI is going to make you better, both in the production process, in the communication process, and so on. So let me first give a little bit of background to this. Why, you might think that these claims and the interrelated threats are not real, and I may not be able to convince you, but at least let me give you some data, both from the US and the United Kingdom, in the domain of labor markets, nature of work, political voice, and social status, to argue that these are actually real. So let's start from the US labor market, which I think is definitely exhibit one if you want to tell a story like this, because the US economy for the 3 decades that followed World War II and for a good part of the before World War II time was one in which a variety of skills were necessary and valued in work. So I am making that point in this figure, showing the evolution of real wages, wages that are adjusted for inflation. So this is really a good measure of prosperity for 5 education group and 2 genders. And for each case, I'm starting the real wages of these different group, weekly wages, if you're curious about that, from 0, so you can sort of trace the cumulative increases or changes in the real incomes of different demographic groups over time. So what you can see from 1963 onwards to about the late 1970s is the second phase of the period of shared prosperity after World War II. The sense in which it's shared prosperity is that these curves are on top of each other. In fact, some of them you cannot see because they are just by the colors of the other ones. They're underneath it. So this is the period in which all different sorts of skills, those of high school workers without high school graduates, workers who have community college degrees or associate degrees, are growing more or less at the same rate as the real wages of very educated people, including the dark blue, who are postgraduates, people who have lawyers, MDs, PhDs, masters, and so on and so forth. In fact, the rate of growth is very, very rapid, about 2.5 percentage points a year, inflation adjusted, which means really, you go from, low income to middle class in the course of about 3 decades. If you go back to the 1950s, the picture is very similar. In fact, the low education manual workers are growing somewhat faster than the most educated workers. So there's no law of capitalism that says that education skills or analytical skills are going to be the only ones valued or they're going to be more valued. Different skills can be valued, and different phases of our history, both in the United States, in the UK, and the rest of the industrialized world, have valued different skills. But from 1980 onwards, you see a very, very different picture, a complete sea change where inequality is increasing. Inequality is increasing because people who have especially postgraduate degrees, but also some college graduates, are experiencing rapid real wage growth in the midst of productivity growth. But look at, especially men, but also to some degree women, who have low education, the orange curve, the green curve there, they're actually declining. This is a really striking pattern because you have no other equivalent for it in the 20th century. In the industrialized world, no equivalent for it in the 20th century either, where for an extended period of time, for almost more than 35 years, the real incomes of about 40% of the population are declining. So why are they declining? Because these are the workers, I will show you, they were engaged in a lot of manual types of tasks that have become much less valuable in the US labor market. Why? We'll talk about that a little bit. But this is exhibit one, that there is this sort of one important aspect of human agency. Work and diverse skills that were being valued are no longer as valued. Now, status is, whether you like it or not, for the reasons we talked about, linked to work, but it also has its own autonomous dynamics. Status changes, and how people organize their lives is a very important part of status. I would argue that with a variety of indicators, and I'll come back to that specifically related to manual work in a second, but with a variety of indicators, you see that status has become much more unequally distributed in human society, in the industrialized world, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, where you see the well-educated live separately, consume different things, enjoy different things to a much greater extent than before, and also self-reproduce themselves. So one way you can see that is through the marriage patterns. On the left, I'm showing you the likelihood that a non-college graduate marries a college graduate, and a college graduate marries a college graduate. And of course, there are more college graduates today than there were in 1960, so both of these increase, but the increase for the blue curve is much sharper. The gap between the two was less than about 30 percentage points. It's now 50 percentage points. But the real big story is the postgraduates. The likelihood that postgraduates marry postgraduates has completely skyrocketed. So that's like the real analytical elite, if there is this ranking, are self-reproducing by living together, living separately in that way. Now, there may still be ways of having the input of the low education, manual workers, artisanal skills, but that would require at least an effort, partly, for example, through the political process. Well, what has happened is that in the political process, the input of the less educated has also disappeared or become much weaker. And one place where you see that is actually in the nature of center-left parties, social democratic parties or workers' parties. Worker parties are called workers' parties, and social democratic parties of the Nordic countries were once, many of them were called workers' parties, well, because they had their origins in trade unions and workers. And if you look at even as late as the 1940s, and the pattern is even stronger when you go further back in the Nordic countries and in the United Kingdom, is that they had the allegiance of the workers, but not the educated. So a very nice paper by Amiri Gethin Thomas Piketty and Clara, I forget her name, yes, thank you, documents this. So here it is, the top one is the summary, but this one is very interesting as well because it shows the country trends. For a number of industrialized countries, they're looking at the voting patterns of the less educated and the more educated. So in particular, to capture the college educated, I think they go to the top 10% educated in each of the countries. And the blue curve is what's the relative voting patterns of the top 10 top 10% in terms of education relative to the bottom 90%. And you can see that across all of these countries, average, the more educated were about 20 percentage points more likely to vote for conservative parties, 20% less likely to vote for social democratic workers' parties. That has been reversed. And the reversal has been particularly pronounced in the United States, where the educated are now about 15 percentage points more likely to vote for Democrats, but it's also very strong in the UK, in Sweden, and other countries. Now, this is not just about who votes, but who also gets a voice. So I'm replicating here the same pattern. On the left, this is the kind of the coefficient on education. It's for voting for the Democratic Party. It's strongly negative, and it becomes very strongly positive. But it's not just who the voters are, who the politicians are. So on the left, on the left at the bottom, what I'm showing, this is from a very nice paper by Suresh Naidu, Ilyana Kuzimienko, and Nicolas Longuet-Marx. So the House of Representative members from the two different parties used to have very different levels of education. The Republicans were much more educated, and the Democrats, reflecting again the working party, workers' party, even though the Democrats were never a true workers' party in the United States, but reflecting that sort of trend, were lower education, and that has completely been reversed. Does this really change what the parties stand for? Well, that's what's very nice about the paper by Kuzimienko, Naidu, and Longuet-Marx, that they identify where it makes a big difference. So they look at the preferences of different education groups for different types of policies. Within the Democrats, within the Republicans, within the population, doesn't actually make much difference. The same divides are true within each party. So these curves here are for what you would see as standard redistributive policy. Higher taxes, tax the rich, and etc. The coefficient on education is 0. So there isn't much difference between low education and high education people. But these policies, which they call, following some political scientists, pre-distribution policies, essentially about work. Big difference. So if you look at minimum wages, provide job for all, protection so that jobs are provided, protected unions, there is a big negative education coefficient. The educated don't like these policies, the low education like these policies. Guess what the Democratic Party elites have adopted over the last 30 years? Exactly, in terms of their voting patterns in the House or in the Senate, exactly the preferences of the very well educated. The same is even more true in the UK. This is the background of candidates for the UK Parliament. About 30% used to be manual workers as late as 1950. If you look at before the war, it's even stronger. And now it's essentially where the Lib Dems and the Conservatives are. Very, very small, almost no manual worker representation. So why do I say that this sort of devaluing of certain types of skills is being exacerbated by AI? And so now coming to the ethics of AI part. So I think the current direction of AI is reducing human agency, both in terms of what it intends to do and to some degree partially succeeds in the production process, and in terms of how it changes our communication and social interaction pattern, and perhaps even more so in terms of what it aspires to do. And to understand what those things are, I think we can first describe them, but perhaps it's more fun to first think about where they're coming from. And my argument is that the current AI field is very much determined by two complementary forces, the two sort of bookends around which most of AI is focused. One is AI ideology, the other one is business models. By AI ideology, I mean what is the view of the leading AI business leaders, scientists, researchers, and most influential public intellectuals about what AI is and what AI should be and what AI can achieve and should achieve. So the priorities that we set to ourselves, which beyond economic monetary incentives, beyond those, it has a very important influence on the direction of research. And the second is the business models of how we have come to monetize digital technologies. And I'll talk about both of them, but in both cases you will see that there is nothing natural about these business models and AI ideology, meaning that they weren't laws of nature. We could have come up with different ways of monetizing them, different ways of making money, different ways of organizing the market structure, and different set of priorities in these instances. So by the AI ideology, I mean the view that what's desirable, feasible, perhaps even inevitable, is a march towards artificial general intelligence. And I think to understand that, you have to go to this brilliant gentleman there, Alan Turing, who really shaped the field of AI. And he was a truly path-breaking mathematician, but his mathematical breakthroughs were focused on a very specific sort of thing, which is computation. And starting from there, he also developed his philosophical ideas of both about how to think about humans and how to think about what machines do. So the key step here is to think of the human brain as just a computation machine. And then his brilliant mathematical insights, which culminated in the Turing machine and the universal Turing machine, is what is the ultimate computation machine. So the universal Turing machine is the ultimate computation machine that can compute anything that's computable. So if the human brain is just a computer that can compute things, and there is an achievable universal Turing machine, then it follows immediately that machines are at some point going to be better than human computation. All the analytical tasks are going to be better done by humans. So that was the way that he simultaneously conceptualized both computers and the human brain. And he said that's actually a desirable direction, that we should move towards autonomous machine intelligence, meaning capabilities of computers, just like through the computational power that they have, that they can act at levels of high human capabilities, and autonomous meaning that this can be done in a self-acting way without anybody, or perhaps without most people directing it. Now, this wasn't an idea that was immediately embraced by everybody, but it became much more powerful because the leaders of AI, some very, very important people here, both as mathematicians like John McCarthy and leaders in AI like Marvin Minsky, they borrowed or swallowed this hook, line, and sinker, taking the field of AI to be all about replicating the human brain. So this Dartmouth project, where the field of AI was christened in 1956, started with a grant from NSF, where their grant proposal said, within 6 months, we're going to crack the problem of human intelligence, and our machines are going to be better. Okay, fine. They didn't turn out to be right on the predictions, but the aspirations has remained. The business models is, we have digital tools. How do we actually make money from them? Well, if you look at the history of computers, you will see that there are just so many different ways that people thought you could make money from computers. And some of them have been tried, but at the end of the day, especially from the time of the software revolution, which may or may not have been completely influenced by these other trends that I've mentioned, but it certainly soon met with it, the basic way that emerged is you produced software and you sell them to firms. And Oracle, IBM, several other companies, SAS, excelled at it, but especially Microsoft, where essentially a very, very large fraction, more than 75% of their money is just selling service products and software services to firms. And the way that firms came, especially in the age of deregulation, competitive pressure from the outside, and shareholder values from Milton Friedman, came to want software was to reduce labor costs. So give me software so that I can do some of the tasks now automatically, either on the shop floor and often in offices, and that will reduce my labor costs. So that became the big business that fueled a lot of the software revolution. Then came the next phase of the digital tools, which is perhaps best epitomized by Google and Facebook, Now you start making money from digital ads. So in the case of Google, 75% of all the money is from digital ads, all this area here. And in the case of Facebook, all of this area, essentially 100% is from digital ads. So now, both of these business models, if you start thinking about it, have in them a natural limit on human agency. In one case, you're automating human work. In the other case, you're trying to guide humans, or perhaps one would say manipulate humans. So both of those are not going to be great for human agency. Of course, human agency can be expanded, as I'm going to argue, with better information, but not if you are trying to feed the information so that you can best monetize them through digital ads. And I think that social media illustrates that. And we can talk more about that in a second. Now, these two threats are quite tightly related. And one way of seeing that is actually look at how we have used digital tools in the US labor market and what that has done to inequality. So here I summarize that with a chart from my work with Pascual Restrepo, which is something I'm heavily building on here. And what this chart does is that instead of looking at 10 demographic groups distinguished by gender and education that I showed you at the beginning to show you how manual skills and lower education skills have become less valued, I'm now looking at more detailed demographic groups distinguished by gender, education, ethnicity, and age. Each one of these circles is one of them. You can look at the color and see which education group we're talking about, and the size of the circle is how big that demographic group is. On the vertical axis, now I am zeroing in on the cumulative change in the real wages during that big period of inequality from 1982 to just before the COVID period. So you see the zero line here? About half of the mass here, about 40% of the mass is below the zero line. That's just repeating what I showed you in that figure. About 40% of US workers have experienced declining real wages despite very decent productivity growth during this era. But what's most interesting here is the horizontal axis. That's the new element that I want to share with you, which is our measure of automation. What fraction of the tasks that each demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated, meaning now they're done by robots, by advanced digital machinery or software. Not much AI, because I'm stopping it here around 2018, and I'll show you what happens after 2018 in a second. And you can see that for the low education groups, high school graduates, for example, the purple ones, about 20% for many of them have now disappeared. And that's very, very strongly tied to the changes in inequality. So a lot of the changes in inequality can be explained by how we have used these digital tools, and almost all of the decline is very tightly linked to this automation picture. But I think it would also be a mistake to think it's just economics. In fact, social status has changed in ways that, of course, touches economics, but is quite different as well. So there are several occupations in the United States and in the United Kingdom, to the best of my knowledge, although I've looked much more at the US data, where returns, labor market returns, what you can make in the labor market, are quite decent. Like, for example, electrician, plumbers. Those jobs, what people call sometimes trades or craft work, are very well compensated, and there is a shortage. Good luck finding an electrician or a plumber when you need it. And that need is going to increase because, even if we do 10% of the promised expansion of the electricity grid, we're going to need more electricians with more diverse skills. But if you ask young people, what they say is, we don't want to go into trades. It's physically demanding, dangerous, dirty. Dirty actually turns out to be a very ideological term. What was dirty was determined by the aristocratic division of labor in the post-Middle Ages especially. Now, that's very different from what you see in the 1940s. So in a survey in 1947, people were asked, men, this is 1947, some outstanding young man is asking advice on which profession they should go into. So 12% was crafts work and operatives, 6.5% mechanical repair. More than law, more than sales and clerical, the crafts manufacturing operatives is almost as large as other professional work. So at the time, for many workers, that was a very high status occupation. So it was the status and the labor market returns together were determining that. Today, if you ask that, there's a big, big, big divide. Those occupations are seen as not just dirty, dangerous, physically demanding, but they're also seen as low status. Now, of course, AI can do many things. Perhaps it can change this picture. So we have to understand first how AI is being used, why it's being used that way, and I think I've shown you my colors when I talked about the AI ideology, and how the beginning of AI is being used. So in a paper that I wrote with David Otter, Joe Hazel, and Pasquale Restrepo, we looked at the AI sort of activity at the establishment business level. And what you see is that there is a lot of talk of AI, not much of it going on in the 2010, but around 2017, 2018, suddenly AI investments are the simple AI, not the sort of the generative AI, large language models, but it sort of takes off. But where does it take off? It's the fourth quartile of establishments when ranked in terms of how many tasks they have that can be replaced by AI. So a lot of it is going for automation. And what you see is a pattern very similar to when PCs were spreading and when other digital tools were spreading. There was a lot of promise of productivity, and it's not realized. Why isn't it realized? Well, we don't know exactly. Perhaps it takes a while. There's certainly good theories that say everything takes longer than you think it will take. But one reason is because if you overinvest, excessively invest in automation, what you're doing is that you're actually replacing things that humans were doing quite well. You're putting not so well calibrated, not so well developed AI technologies or digital technologies in their place. And when you do that, you're not going to get productivity growth. In fact, you might get productivity shrinkage. So it's not just human agency as a value, which I think is very important as I've tried to argue, but also for prosperity, this is not going to work very well. Now, it's very important that I emphasize, I'm not arguing that automation is bad. Automation has been with us for 1750, beginning of the factories where we started mechanizing the process of production, and it will be with us. And nobody wants to go back to shovels and the people using their physical strength to do extremely difficult, dangerous tasks. But the question is one of unbalanced automation. When you automate things, what you're doing is that you're taking tasks away from humans. So what ideally, both for productivity and for his human agency, meaning of work, and as I am arguing for democracy, you're going to need then to find other meaningful, high status, high reward activities for humans. And where does that come from? It comes from new products, new tasks, new things that we could do. So if you look at periods in which labor was doing well, sometimes businesses wanted it to do well, sometimes they didn't. One ambiguous character is Henry Ford, who was no big friend of labor. And he was also a leader in automation, introducing new electrical machinery, advanced reorganization of the factory together with interchangeable parts and then later assembly lines. But Henry Ford's factories were also hubs of new tasks. New machinery was combined with new skills, new activities for workers, and it was all undergirded with much greater level of engineering, planning, white-collar clerical work. And you see here, you see the new advanced machinery, and workers are doing very critical part of it. So whether he wanted it or not, but part of the reason why productivity actually surged and why, as he went into mass production, actually employment in the auto industry increased by tenfold, was because workers were critical and they were doing new things as the machines were also spreading. Now, I think AI has the capability to help us do that if we use it right. And it has that capability because what AI should be thought of about is not artificial general intelligence, is not something that's going to replace humans or manipulate humans or take control of us, but as something that provides information. Electricians. What is it that electricians do? Electricians are engaged in a series of problem-solving tasks. And what constrains them is information. How do I deal with this problem that I haven't encountered before? If you're the very best electrician in the world, perhaps you can work it out. For most mediocre electricians or middle-of-the-road electricians, diagnosing the problem, finding solutions is a very challenging thing. So what AI, as an informational tool, has the capacity to do is provide real-time, context-dependent, and just-in-time information so that you can actually boost the expertise of the workers. But that means two things. One is that you're going to maintain human agency, because what you're using it for is to get human workers to do better in their jobs and their problem-solving tasks. Second, you really need the human agency because you need to give them reliable information they can understand and process if they're going to do the work. Again, we're not talking of full automation. Full automation would be AI does the work, workers stand aside. I've argued that's not desirable on ethical, normative grounds. It's not desirable from productivity grounds, but it is desirable to provide new tasks, more sophisticated tasks for workers. But then we need really the AI information to be expanding their human agency. But there are big barriers to that. I think the current architecture of AI wouldn't work because reliable information that you can understand. So if I tell, Daniel, you're going left, you should go right. Well, if Daniel's agency doesn't matter, it's very easy. He should go right, he should obey me. I can manipulate him or I can become his overlord and he'll go right. But that's not what we want. What we want is I give him this information and he evaluates it. Sometimes he goes left, sometimes he goes right. That's also very good for human agency because we don't want everybody to go right, then you're not going to have the experimentation and the diversity. So, but how can Daniel make that choice? So he needs to understand what is it that I am recommending, why I'm recommending it, what information my recommendation already encapsulates, and how he can combine that with his own expertise, his own values, his own additional information that I may not have. So it really requires a complete understanding of what I am recommending, where I'm coming from, together with his own actuation of agency. But even more custom-made tools make that completely impossible today. A very nice study, I have two examples here, but let me skip the predictive policing. This one's more interesting. It's by my colleagues Nikhil Agrawal and Tobias Salt on doctors for diagnosis. And this is a custom-made tool, much more sophisticated in some sense, and arguably has good information. But it turns out that when given access to this tool, doctors don't make any better decisions. And part of the reason, or actually all of the reason, is exactly what I described here, because they don't understand why the recommendation comes from. Especially, they overweight the information when they themselves have some bias towards it, even though it's not fully justified. So the conformity bias gets much better. And they don't understand when AI is uncertain. So they put weight on AI precisely when they shouldn't put it, precisely for duplicating their information. The opposite of the human agency. But again, what else can they do? They don't understand where the AI doesn't explain, this is what I have, this is how you should combine it, and the architecture of it is not there. Now, again, if you have a view that we're heading firmly towards artificial general intelligence, this wouldn't matter because AI will get there. It doesn't need the human learning, it doesn't need the human agency. But in fact, reality seems to be very far from that. First of all, AI models very strongly need the human learning, human agency. And any shortcuts that they have around it doesn't seem to work. So one place we can see that is, for example, one thing that's so amazing about these natural language models is they actually can write simple programs, subroutines in Java, HTML, even Python. How do they do that? Is it because they understand the rules of programming, like AlphaZero did understand the rules of chess, which were very simple, of course? No, programming doesn't have as simple rules. The way it turns out that they do it is just like other things with the tokens, and because they had a lot of inputs on how simple subroutines are written, when it works and when it doesn't work. And when did that come from? It comes from a number of sources, some books, etc. But a very excellent source was this website called Stack Overflow, where there's a math Stack Overflow, a computer Stack Overflow, and you go and ask questions, and experts provide their time, they think about the problem. In fact, in the Math Overflow, you actually end up with many new theorems, because I ask a question, how do you solve this problem? And then somebody puts a lot of effort and then comes up with some discovery that they didn't know before. But this is what happens to the Stack Overflow after ChatGPT is revealed, and people now go to it rather than go to Stack Overflow. It completely collapses. The other websites, Math Overflow, or the equivalent of the Stack Overflow in Chinese or Russian, where GPT is not allowed, they remain constant. So this is like AI digging its own grave. It depends on collective learning by humans, but it's actually because of exactly the tension that I explained a second ago, it's actually making collective learning much harder. Now you can say, oh, perhaps AI can learn from AI. So perhaps the next AI model can learn from ChatGPT about how to program. Well, this is a controversial area, but a number of papers show that that doesn't work. So if you feed into AI models today, AI-generated data, you get what they call a model collapse. So the model performance falls very, very sharply. So again, even from a consequentialist, very, very goal-oriented viewpoint, if you want AI to work better, you really need collective learning by humans, collective information generation by humans. So where are we then with democracy? Well, all of these things are inimical to democracy, because a democracy, as any political system, is about information too. How do we use information, and how controls information? You know, the panopticon, which Jeremy Bentham thought was a great idea, wasn't a great idea, because it wasn't just making better information, it was about who controls information. Well, I think there are many ways in which AI could act like a much more sophisticated version of panopticon, because some people concentrate information in their hands and they're going to start using it. Well, you can see that with the Chinese Communist Party's leadership in AI. A lot of it goes to surveillance and facial recognition. But it's no different when Google and Facebook try to, or other platforms try to monetize AI too. A lot of it is manipulative, and a lot of it is going to create big tensions for democracy. As people are sidelined, temptation to manipulate them is going to increase. And as people all get information that's not always true and shared, the problem is going to get much, much worse. So in some sense, I think Hannah Arendt, who wrote 60 years ago, when she said, if everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you'll believe the lies, but nobody believes anything anymore. Well, what is democracy? It's about shared understanding and that collective actualization of making decisions. So if you don't have that shared understanding, I think democracy is going to be really in trouble. And again, this is not a problem that's just limited to China or Iran. Chinese technologies that's very much targeting on surveillance is spreading around the world. Just Huawei, one company, has exported surveillance technologies from China to 60 other countries, most of them autocratic. So what's the alternative, the redesigning AI? Well, I think we need a different vision, different business models, and different objectives. Fortunately, many precedents exist. So as early as Alan Turing was articulating the view of autonomous machine intelligence, other people were thinking of a different approach to what we want from digital tools. Norbert Wiener in 1949 was already worried about what robots would do for work, what robots would do for human meaning, and what robots would do to inequality. And he articulated a different set of ideas about how humans and machines, digital machines, can work together. In the book with Simon Johnson, we call this machine usefulness to contrast it with machine intelligence. But this wasn't just philosophy, by the way, because many people who either influenced by Norbert Wiener or arriving to the same, I would say, obvious set of ideas that machines should be useful and complementary to humans, actually have been at the forefront of the technological innovations in the digital areas. Most of the things that we love and cherish today, menu-driven computers like on your phone, mouse, computer mouse, hyperlink, hypertext, internet, ARPANET, all of them came out of a research agenda and a philosophical agenda that was about machine usefulness. What J.C.R. Licklider, again 60 years ago, called man-computer symbiosis, human-machine symbiosis. And what he had in mind is that computers are going to be informational tools for humans to make better decisions. That's where the aspirations of the internet came from for him. But, of course, the technology wasn't up to it. Yes, you could use computers a little bit for better information, but today AI provides a much greater capability for having reliable information delivered to educators, crafts workers, healthcare workers, creative artists in a way that can really expand their human agency. Will we get there? Well, in general, you may be heading in the right direction or the wrong direction. I think we are heading in the wrong direction. If you go more and more in the wrong direction, you're getting further away from that objective. Then the question is, can we be hopeful that in the future there's going to be a correction mechanism? In general, there are 3 correction mechanisms that we can one we can hope about. One is a market correction mechanism. Somebody realizes that we can make money, more money, doing the right things rather than the wrong things. We can have the scientific process, market pushes in one direction, but I think rather than using nuclear technology for nuclear weapons, we can use them for peaceful ends, and the scientific process will get me there, or institutional responses. Well, I think the market process and the scientific process will not get us there. The market process, the markets are great. I'm an economist. If I want to allocate apples and oranges, no better alternative than markets. But innovation, markets don't work very well for innovation. Innovation is all about externalities. You create things that other people enjoy, or you create things that hurt other people, like the distributional consequences of the automation. And we've seen that throughout throughout history, and we're seeing that today. That's why the twin forces of business models and ideology in the digital industry mean that the market process is not going to work. What about the scientific process? Could the scientific process get us there? In principle, yes, but in practice, I don't think so, because the scientific process for digital research, and especially AI research, has been completely taken over by the tech world. So in 2000, if you look at AI models, about 99% was done by academic research funded by the government. Today, academic research is 10%, and even that 10% is completely dependent on industry money, industry largesse. The big part in the industry itself, or academia-industry collaboration. But if you want to do anything with generative AI, that costs $100 million, $200 million. You're not going to be able to do that with an NSF grant or with an ESRC grant. So the scientific process, both in terms of its aspirations and in terms of its functionality, is now very much following the tech world. So how have we done it in the past? We've done it through the third one, the institutional responses. So the early factory, automation, control, were very different technologies, very different times, but the same kind of concerns. And that's why, even though productivity surged in the United Kingdom, look at the wages of handloom weavers. Their real wages fell by 70%. And how did things get reversed? Was it the market process? Was it the scientific process? No, I think it was a big process of institutional reform. There was fundamental political reform, democracy, which was very weak or non-existent in the 1820s, early 1830s, became much more of an input into where technology where work went, and where, of course, the future of democracy itself went. Labor organization, labor voice is critical. If you want to make labor more productive, you can't do that without labor voice. And if you want labor to get a share from the pie, you can't do that without labor bargaining power. In the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, labor organizations were banned and heavily prosecuted, but it was very important that they started becoming recognized, and other anti-labor things like the Masters and Servants Acts were abolished, and that was critical, and a redirection of technology. The direction of technology moved away from just automate to doing other things, new industries, railways, connecting the economy and making workers more productive. So I think very different time, very different technologies, very different set of issues, but there is a lot to learn from history, and that was very critical for the enrichment and the rise in the living standards. And it was also very critical for human agency, which is, much better for human agency to be a worker in the early 20th century than a servile laborer or a worker in those mechanized loom factories in the 1820s, 1830s. So I think for all of these purposes, redesigning AI, redirecting AI is a necessity, and I think we can do it. We have to start by recognizing that it is socially desirable and is technically feasible to have AI in a pro-worker way, in a way that helps workers, in a way that doesn't try to replace them, in a way that doesn't go after crazy ideas like artificial general intelligence, but becomes an informational tool for workers, informational tools for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Daron. I think we've been privileged there to listen to a masterclass of genuinely rigorous academic research with a real moral purpose. We're going to have a panel very soon of some wonderful people responding to Daron, but I'd like to maybe invite people now to have one or two questions from the audience. We have a microphone. Can I just remind you, a question is like one sentence with the question mark at the end of it. Nigel, do you want to go first? Can you say who you are as well?
Thanks very much. Nigel Warburton, thank you, that's really interesting. My only observation is the question, what about leisure? I thought leisure was a good thing. I've tried to organise my life to have less work, more productive leisure, more meaningful time, playing the guitar, reading books, talking about philosophy, things which don't necessarily earn me money.
Okay. Can we do one more question? Yes, there, behind, in the green top.
Thank you. I'm Pippa, a DPhil student at the Geography and Environment Department. So my question is, following up on your last slide, I was wondering if you can share your comments and views about the legislation around AI, the EU AI Act, or the discussion around legislating that in the US. Is that a step forward to the right direction of some kind of institutional correction for AI, or is that not even solving the problem at the service level? Thank you.
Excellent. So let me answer both of these excellent questions. Absolutely, leisure is great, and we want leisure, but leisure combined with a purpose. I think 24 hours of leisure wouldn't make sense for most people. It may make sense for some people. Keynes thought so. Keynes thought that we would go towards more and more leisure for everybody, but his view of leisure, of course, is what he enjoyed, and he had a great purpose in life as the leading intellectual of his time. I think that the preferences about leisure are quite bimodal in society, and not just in UK society or US society. There are some people who want more leisure, but they don't want that leisure because they are forced out of work, and there are some people who actually really enjoy work and they want to complement it with the right amount of leisure. So there are a lot of experimental studies now, a couple of experimental studies, not a lot would be an exaggeration. But what they find is that in very diverse culture, people really value the ability to earn their living. So a very interesting one, for example, that was published in the American Economic Review just a year and a half ago, they do these experiments with Rohingya refugees in the Cox's Bazar. And these are very, very poor people. They're really sort of struggling to make a living. And they are offered in different treatment groups money or work. So if they get the work, they are psychologically happier, they feel healthier, and very importantly, on average, they are willing to take 30% less money if it's work for them rather than they view as handout. So again, it's socially constructed. Perhaps in a different world, people may not have that idea. But you see this in Kenya, there's another experimental study, and in the Europe-US context, one of the thing that makes people most unhappy is the loss of their job. So again, I think why loss of their job? Because they not see that as, oh, well, now I can do more leisure. That's a loss in my purpose. And I think in terms of AI regulation, I think we need to have a really multi-pronged approach, and I think European Union is playing a very important role. But I think the problem with the European Union is that it's not an AI producer, it's not an innovator, so you can only go so far. I think the values that the EU Act enshrines are very, very basic and very, very important, and we need more of them. We need more of them in the United States as well. But I believe it's not enough, because as I have formulated, the problem is to redirect AI. And you're not going to just do that by putting regulations. That can help. But you really need a positive agenda for this is the kind of AI we want, and this is how we can get it with the right fiscal incentives, with the right subsidies for research, and the right norms and regulations. And I think European Union can play that role, can play a leadership role, but it needs to do two things at the same time in order to get that. One is to have a much clearer agenda for doing this, not just defensive or reactive regulation, but second, also become an innovator. I think there's only so much you can do if US and China are developing the technologies and the EU is just a regulator for it. Thank you.
So sorry, Daron.
Of course.
Sorry. Can we thank Daron one more time for that fantastic performance?
I think I was told to take this one here.
So now I'm going to invite my colleague, Ekaterina Hertog, to come and chair the panel discussion of the lecture, and she will introduce the brilliant commentators.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Daron. First of all, I'd like to invite the panel members to come maybe and sit already so I could introduce you and people could see you.
Oh, we don't have enough seats here. You're gonna stand?
It's fine, I'll
Are you,
stand.
I can go down. Which can?
I think it's, thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, without further ado, we have really a perfect panel today to discuss Daron's work after this really interesting and thought-inspiring presentation. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to introduce our 4 panelists, and I'll just go in the order that they're being seated here. So we've got Professor Isabel Ferreras, FNRS Professor in Sociology at the University of Louvain. She leads the democratizing work at Harvard Center for Labor and Just Economy, and she's currently a visiting fellow. We've had the pleasure of having her as a visiting fellow at the Institute of Ethics and AI, University of Oxford. All our panelists have published, written a lot of relevant work in the field of AI, future of work, as well as democracy, but I will just mention one recent relevant publication. So Isabel's just got a book, edited volume out, with the title Democratizing the Corporation. Next is Professor Daniel Susskind, who is a research professor of economics at King's College London and a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics and AI. Daniel's just published a book with the title Growth, a History and Reckoning, as well, which deals a lot with work, technology, and sort of our future. Next is Professor Josiah Ober, who is a professor of political science at Stanford University, is currently a visiting professor at Balliol College, and he has recently published a book with the title A Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives. So again, hugely topical. Finally, Professor Carl Frey, Edith Schwartz, associate professor of AI and work at Oxford Internet Institute, and a fellow of Mansfield College at Oxford University. So many of us have know of Carl's also recent book, Technology Trap, Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation. So I don't want to eat more time. I will now invite all our panelists, perhaps again in order they're seated, to spend about 5 minutes each commenting on Daron's presentation, and then I'll invite Daron to respond to the panelists, and finally we'll open the floor to the general Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katja. So can you hear me? Yes? It's the early morning for me. Thank you so much. I wanted first, to thank you, Daron, of course, for this brilliant talk, and to start from your quote, which is that only with democracy and the right type of regulation can we make sure that we have ethical AI. And among which dimensions you identify labor voice and organization. And I think we got very clearly from your talk that technological advances will radicalize existing power imbalances, and that the degree of that radicalization is a question today. And we can clearly see many voices inside academia, but outside also in the industry and in society at large, many voices really identifying that there is a window here that is going to get closed. We don't have that much time ahead of us, and so it's a very historic moment at which we should be very clear about the direction we want to set for this development. So thank you, Daron, for your leadership in this. And I will use my few minutes to shed light on that labor voice and organization dimension, because I would like to argue that it is critical that we understand that we need to go beyond the old conceptions about managerial labor discussion, what I would say an old-fashioned view of labor rights that is centered around mostly compensation and benefits, which are super important, and especially for instance, data cleaners in the global south, it is hugely important, of course, that we care for their compensation, their benefits, their health and working conditions, working time, for instance. But that is not enough. That is not enough because what's at stake is really to recognize that workers need a meaningful say over these technologies. First, because they are themselves the producers of these technologies. Without their labor investment, there would be no technology, no service produced, because this is, as you know, all not artificial intelligence. It's about human intelligence, obviously. And so workers are particularly well positioned to identify and have a say about the ends that these technologies serves and the means also, how they are used in the workplace. And from that perspective, it's critical also to see that workers are the ones who are directly governed by these new technologies. They are the ones who are monitored, the ones on which the surveillance is applied. And so there is no room, basically, in a democratic society for human beings being put under conditions of being governed without them to have the ability to consent on those rules. So this really truly speaks to the human agency that Daron referred to, and this requires to really move beyond the traditional conceptions we have in industrial relations, in the whole knowledge about work that sees the labor management divide as making what is called as managerial prerogative the domain of management. No, it cannot be the case. And what's interesting is to see that today, as we speak, there are developments going into that direction. And I would just like to mention 3 of them. Microsoft and the AFL-CIO just 6 months ago made a really groundbreaking news. They actually set an agreement on Microsoft being neutral vis-à-vis workers being willing to organize. Being neutral in the US context, it's like a big thing to happen. And what's even more interesting is that they agree on setting up a deliberation mechanism on how the corporation is going to use these technologies, so that they will discuss these with the workers' representatives. This is really about governing the introduction of technology within the workplace. You have the Hollywood Writers Guild, who waged the longest strike in their history against indeed the threat of AI for their business. And what's also very key to see here is that the agreement contains a deliberation mechanism that actually enables workers to monitor how AI is going to be used in the industry, and actually agreeing, so the both parties agree on the fact that there should be an agreement on workers' side for these technologies to be used. And I can mention the last instance of this, I believe, is the EU Platform Work Directive, which is also very innovative in the sense that it speaks of new rights vis-à-vis algorithmic management and the ability for workers to use the tools that the company use for their own purpose of getting organized themselves, so that they can form their own views about how they are governed by these technologies and develop a meaningful position about these technologies, and that even in the absence of a union being present in that company or not. So what's at stake is really, in my understanding, that these are weak signals, but weak signals that really speaks in the direction of pushing for giving the meaningful set of rights to workers so that they can really have human agency. And so I will finish by this last point, which is Daron's work really shows that it took 3 generations for the industrial revolution to really bring goods for workers. That is higher wages, better health and working conditions, and eventually, actually, the right to vote in the police. So I don't think we have the luxury of 3 generations. And there is good and bad news here, because the bad news is that we don't have only the artificial intelligence crisis looming, we have the climate change crisis that is not at fast pace happening. But the good news is that actually part of the solution lies for both the climate crisis and the challenge that AI poses in our life. The solution lies in the same place, which is to empower humans so that they can really have a meaningful say in their work life, in the corporation in particular, so that they can actually collectively put a halt at an extractivist rationality that is pushing our economic system to the limits of the planet and to possibly to the limits of our democratic experiment as a whole. So thank you so much, Daron, for this inspiring talk.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much indeed for the talk. Two short reflections. One, I thought what you said about ideology was fascinating, and I wonder if there's also another sense in which the sort of ideological challenge is even worse than you described. I mean, I'm often struck by how, in the sort of commercial setting, when people talk about technology, the narrative is that these technologies will free you up. They'll take on the routine, repetitive, boring stuff and allow you to free up to be more human. And it's baked into the words that we use. So the word robot comes from the Czech word robota, meaning slavery or drudgery or toil. And that narrative, I think, continues today. But what's interesting, of course, about the latest technologies is that they're not just doing the routine stuff. They're starting to encroach on more and more of the sort of non-routine activities, the kind of activities that we often think, would provide people with meaning and purpose. So I wonder if there's another sense in which kind of continuing that ideology that all this is doing is the routine stuff and you don't need to worry about it, kind of makes these ideological challenges even more significant. Thank you. The other reflection that I had was around the challenges that you described in sort of steering and redirecting technological progress with respect to AI. And I know it's something that you've written about before, and I think was reflected in your comments just then. And I suppose my question for you is to what extent that sort of realism or that kind of fatalism about our ability to shape the direction of technological progress in practice ought to inform how we think about how we respond. And I think there's a useful analogy with climate change, which is one that you've drawn before, in the sense that for the last 40 years, we've had a technology that we know has harmful effects, in the sense that we're developing dirty technologies. And we've known roughly what we ought to do about it, in the sense that something like a carbon tax of $100 per ton of CO2 by 2030 will help us respond to the challenge. And yet, in large part because of the political economy, we've failed to do it adequately. We've made progress, but we haven't done enough. And so what we see today is a strategy with respect to that challenge that's both mitigation, in the sense trying to redirect technological progress, but also adaptation, that we've had to accept that we're going to have to learn to live with higher temperatures. And it seems to me that the challenge of redirecting AI is even harder, not just because of the political economy, which I think it has in common with climate change, but I think also because of the uncertainty. There is a lot of disagreement and debate about exactly what the kind of economic and non-economic impacts ex ante of these technologies will be. So all of this matters because the strategy that you set out in the talk is largely one of mitigation. But I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on what adaptation might look like, or if that's a sort of reasonable question to be asking. if we can't steer and direct the technologies as we have in the past? You know, do we need to, for instance, embrace more or explore more radical approaches to redistribution? Or do we need to think about how we might provide people with meaning and purpose and human agency in a world with less work? So again, thank you very much. Those are my 2 reflections. Thank you.
I'll just add my thanks for what was really, I think, a terrific talk. I'm just going to suggest that Daron's focus on flourishing democracy, agency, and work could be linked even more tightly together. And we could do this, or at least we could imagine how to do this through a somewhat unusual source, and that is the thought of the ancient philosopher Aristotle. So if we go back to Aristotle, he claims that what distinguishes human beings as a particular being type from other being types, other animals, are particular constitutive capacities of hypersociability, that is, we're political animals, we live in certain kinds of societies, reason, that is, rationality in the use of means, and which yields advantage or a conception of how to gain advantage, but also rationality in respect to ends, therefore morality or justice. So we have hypersociability, use of reason, and communication, use of language, use of symbols. So the free exercise of each of these basic capacities is, according to Aristotle, necessary, if not completely sufficient, for human flourishing. If we put these capacities together in activity, that is the agency, as you point out, of individuals acting together, what we get is democracy. That is, democracy just is the pro-social, that is, advancing valued communal ends, use of reason and communication in deliberation and decision. And it's something that can be done by all, because these are human capacities. So democracy then is an intrinsic value to us as humans. It's an activity that exemplifies flourishing. And moreover, it has instrumental value. It is efficient. It works better than autocracy to produce value, as your own work has often shown, including sustained economic growth. And why is that? Well, partly legitimacy, motivation, but also because of greater epistemic diversity. A pluralistic demos means diverse inputs in terms of experience, information, know-how into deliberation and decision, which, when rightly structured, institutionally structured, beats the unitary expert. The autocrat lives in an epistemic bubble, almost by definition. All he really ever hears is that chorus of those North Korean kids singing his praises. So all of this suggests that Daron is on the right track with requiring institutions and democratization of AI development and regulation. And we have reason to say that to the extent that AI degrades our human capacities for our being hypersocial, for using reason, for communication, it will degrade flourishing just in and of itself. It makes us worse, in a sense, as the kind of beings we are. And furthermore, it will threaten democracy and thereby further degrade flourishing, insofar as democracy simply is the aggregation of those basic capacities. But on the other hand, AI could be designed and regulated such that it enhances human pro-social use of reason and communication, not only in political contexts, certainly in political contexts, but not only in political contexts, but also in the context of work. So you mentioned Henry Ford, fascinating figure. One of the things that Ford said, or at least was reputed to say notoriously, that it was that I want to hire a pair of hands. Unfortunately, a head comes attached to it, or to them. So his whole goal was to be the mind, to have the factory organized, be the mind behind the use of the hands, which he was going to pay, a decent salary for his own instrumental reasons. But if we imagine that we can in fact use AI to provide more information that connects together what is in individual heads with their individual experience or individual sources of knowledge to what they're doing with their hands, then we can imagine then the workplace being a place that would integrate these human capacities in just the way that political democracy does. Meanwhile, increasing and more equitably distributing the benefits of social cooperation in various work endeavors. So, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to add the last footnote to Daron's excellent talk. It sounds like most people on this panel do agree that AI needs redirection, and speaking for myself, but probably also for a few others, I think Daron's work plays no small part in having shaped our views on this topic. The obvious question that follows is how? And there I think Daron also outlines a number of promising directions, whether it's related to the tax code and how we excessively tax labor relative to capital, and how that shapes investment more in automation technologies rather than technologies that save labor or create new jobs, whether it's an ad tax that could potentially shift companies to more subscription-based models, which are less reliant on extracting personal data from people to place ads. And so, broadly speaking, I think these proposals amount to shaping the reward function of the economy in a way to incentivize individuals and businesses to, in a decentralized manner, pursue the technologies that they think are most likely to have the greatest benefit. What I might add, though, is that I think that just by restoring competition, we could actually get a lot of mileage, and I've heard you speak about this in the past as well. Large companies tend to have scale, and so they are more likely to invest in automation technologies for that reason. Small companies are more likely to introduce new products, new tasks for labor that create new types of jobs. And I think a key challenge over the past couple of decades is that if we go back to the 1970s, profitability in an industry used to predict entry. And that relationship has seemingly broken down. And a large part of that has to do, it seems, with lobbying and regulation. And I think that poses a challenge for everybody who wants to think about regulation in this space. Something I often hear is that we ought to regulate AI in similar ways that we regulate pharma. But if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, it's dominated by a few very large companies. There's not a lot of entry going on, and innovation is extremely expensive. And I think a key challenge going forward with AI is that the more we emphasize the risks, the more likely we are going to get regulation that reduces entry and reduces competition. If I was a cynic, I might suggest that there's not a coincidence that a lot of the narratives around the risks of AI are coming out of Silicon Valley, and that may relate to efforts to undercut models like open source. And drawing on some of Daron's other excellent work, it seems to me that what's required for regulation not to work in the interests of the corporations we're trying to regulate is at least one of two things, or preferably both. It's a mobilized and not polarized society, and it's a strong administrative state. And looking at Britain and the United States today, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to me that we have either of those. What I do think seems to be a more promising direction of policy making, in addition to changing the reward function of society along the lines that Daron has suggested, is trying to reduce barriers to entry even further. Thoughtful commentary by people like Dan Coyle has suggested that we might need something similar to CERN for artificial intelligence, whereby academics and smaller firms can get access to the computing resources and the kind of data sets that larger companies currently have a monopoly on, and that might facilitate more entry, greater diversity, and even shape the direction of technology in more labor-friendly directions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Katja, and thank you. These are really fantastic, thought-provoking, and extremely generous comments. So let me say a few words, because I think I don't want to take more time. I think we want to have more input from the audience as well, but those are such good comments that I think they deserve not responses, but expansion. And I think, let me start with Isabel. 100%. I think Isabel, I'm learning from Isabel on these topics as well, but there's a lot of important emphasis in what Isabel said, and let me break it into three pieces. One is, if indeed the objective is to use any technology, but in particular AI, for workers, you cannot do that from worker voice. So if your objective is to solve the problem of poverty in a village in Burkina Faso, and you say, I'm going to do that, but never ever visiting Burkina Faso, never hearing from anybody from that village, I think people will laugh at you. But essentially, that's where we are. We are talking about creating tools for workers without hearing from workers. So worker voice is critical. The other important idea that is implicit in what Isabel said is that at least one conceptualization of labor power was probably never right, but it's more incorrect today. So the leading model of that economists use is called the right to manage, which is unions make demands and then the firm then decides. So all of the authority for employment, organizational choices, and technologies in the hands of the firm. Now, bargaining never works that way, but perhaps it could be approximated that way, but it would be a terrible idea to do it today. Why? Because imagine that unions become stronger, say, in the United States, and we are in the right to manage world. They just ask for higher wages. What will firms do? We are providing them lots of tools for automation, and suddenly labor became more expensive. They're just going to automate more. The alternative, as shown by German system, or in the Nordic countries, is that actually the bargaining is over many other things. And in the US, it's always been a little bit like that sometimes, and not other times, which is you bargain about how you use the technologies, what new tasks you're going to create, training. I think all of these are absolutely critical, so we need to move to a model like that. Now, then there is the issue that I think Isabel has been a leader on, which is the way you do that is, for example, through economic bicameralism. You empower workers to be decision makers. And I think some version of that could be very interesting. But there's a nuance there, which I think Isabel and I will continue to talk about, which is how do you create the right voice while also encouraging experimentation and diversity by employers? So Steve Jobs may have been a very difficult person. Probably I wouldn't want him as my neighbor. But he was very creative. And that creativity meant that he often went against the wishes of a lot of people. So do we want an environment in which we have Steve Jobs? And can we have that with workplace democracy, or what amount of workplace democracy. And I think workplace democracy doesn't need to be absolute, because we have another mechanism. If it works, it's the labor market, that I can have exit as well as voice. Both of those are very important. If we take away exit, if the labor markets don't work, if we are in a workless environment, then it becomes really bad. But we do need voice. If the labor market is working, is generating enough jobs, then we can complement some voice, but still a lot of discretion, and go from there. But there's other nuances. We'll continue to debate those. But 100%, those are really, really critical issues. Thank you, Daniel. And I think absolutely non-routine automation is going to be much more challenging. And the direction of technological change, we have a lot of evidence that direction of technological change is endogenous in the speak of economists, which means that when we change conditions, including policy, it responds. But different technologies are going to give us different capabilities for doing that. So it may be easy to redirect technological change towards different types of crops. It may be much harder for AI, especially because we don't have a good measurement of what is more human complementary AI. When I make a manager much better at directing work or controlling work, I'm complementing the manager, but I may not be complementing the worker. So there are a lot of nuances, and I think, Daniel raised those issues when he discussed or wrote a comment on a paper that I wrote 4 years ago on the same issue of redesigning AI. And I think he was astute and making the same point, which is that adaptation may be necessary, because we're not going to be able to, well, at least I think he was more pessimistic at the time, that we would be able to direct technological change. He sounded a little bit more closer to me today, so I take credit. So absolutely, I think some amount of adaptation is going to be necessary. But 3 things. One is, you don't want to undermine the mitigation part or redirecting technological part. And you can redirect it, you can undermine it in 3 ways. You can undermine it by taking away worker voice in all the institutions. You can undermine it by blind techno-optimism, because if you say everything's going to work, you actually take away the intellectual force of it. But you can also undermine it with defeatism. So if you say, we cannot go anywhere other than worklessness, so we need to have a UBI, I think that's also undermining the redirecting technological change agenda. So I think there are important things that we can do for adaptation, but we don't need to go to UBI, which I think, by the way, from the human agency, human flourishing perspective, would be not a good idea, because it would really enshrine really deep hierarchies in society. So I think we need a better social safety net, but an enabler. So one place where adaptation is really critical is training, training, training. We need more training for workers with diverse skills, and that's a great way of adapting to technological change. We also may need job programs or other protections. I think we have to be open-minded, but I don't think we need to throw in the towel, and I think that's great that we're getting closer on that. Josh, I thank you very much. Those were excellent comments, and I think the word epistemic diversity, I think, is exactly right. Perhaps I should have used that. And you're absolutely right. I think the Aristotelian foundations here, or the Athenian foundations here, are great. I mean, what's so remarkable about Athenian democracy, I don't know how they stumbled upon this, but the idea that among the citizens, okay, fine, women and slaves were excluded, but among the citizens, they did this by lot. So it's not like the wisest person, it's not the one who has the greatest experience, but we want to hear from everybody. So symbolically, I think it's really grappling with the same issues. Of course, we're not going to go to electing our politicians by lot, but I think learning from those experiences where they failed and what their aspirations were, I think is very, very important. And the way that you have emphasized the capabilities and the reason and the morality, I think we have to find the right language, but I think those are exactly the right issues. And Carl, thank you very much. 100%, I think competition is critical, and you are 100% also right that competition has been undermined. Antitrust is being the most negligent thing in the US arsenal of negligence, and it's been, again, intellectual ideas are really important here. The argument that, we have all these huge companies because there are these economies of scale or network economies or economies of data. Well, of course there are, but there were big economies of scale for Standard Oil as well, but that wasn't why Standard Oil was big. If you look at what the big tech companies they've done, is they've completely hogged all the resources. Each one of Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook has been engaged in dozens of acquisitions. And many of these acquisitions are either incorporating technologies that could have been rival for them or actually killing these technologies. So dozens of companies have been bought by these giants and have been put to rest because they could be competitors to them. So that's exactly supporting Carl's point. And why have they been able to do that? Ideological. You know, the ideas of Chicago School becoming dominant among judges was very important, but also lobbying. But I would say, you know, competition is not enough. So today, for example, if you change nothing else and you just make competition easier in the social media space, you're going to get more social media companies, but they're going to try to make the same money in the same way by monetizing data and coming up with even more addictive ways, just like TikTok has done. If you break up Meta into Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, all of them are going to keep up the same business model. So you really need other things, perhaps the CERN model, perhaps subsidies, perhaps other types of regulations, so that new business models can come in. And we know, again, from recent history, new business models are not non-starters. Wikipedia is one of the most successful parts of the internet. It's a completely different business model. Subscription models were doing quite well for a while. So I think we can have this diversity, a variety of business models, and I think that will be much more conducive. And of course, democracy is key again. We can only get there if democracy works, and if democracy becomes dysfunctional, lobbying is going to become even worse. And you're absolutely right. I don't know for sure, but when Sam Altman goes and says, regulate us, but listen to me, I also become a little suspicious.
Thank you very much, Daron. Yeah, I would like to, let's see. We've got about 10 minutes, and I'd like to open the floor to the general Q&A. So, anyone? Yeah? Yeah, you were. I think you were earlier. So.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion and the presentation. I have one question about, you know, when you think about redirecting AI, how do you think about it in a global context? Especially today, we have geopolitical rivalry, and who is going to initiate a certain initiative to guide AI development into the right direction? Thank you.
Absolutely, that's a very important consideration, but I don't think it's an absolute consideration. First of all, you know, obviously, you know, China has a different agenda and a different direction of research that gets fueled by Chinese investments, especially those that come from data or from the governments. But there's a lot of common area, and there are a lot of open areas as well. And the other thing that we have to see here is that actually, you know, the claim that the claim that AI cannot be regulated or that technologies cannot be regulated in a global context are proven wrong exactly by China. The Chinese government is extremely successful in controlling AI. Now, we may not agree with its methods, we may not agree with its objectives, but the direction of research is very much shaped by the priorities of the Chinese government. How the technologies are used, when they can be rolled out, who can get access to them, is completely shaped by Chinese government policies. EU, as the earlier question indicated, is also doing a lot, and contrary to what people originally said, tech companies are responding because the EU is a big market. So the outlier here is the US. And there's a lot US can do, and it's not going to run into the sort of, if the moment the US does the regulation, suddenly it's going to fall behind in the race with China. I think that is definitely not on the agenda. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but there's also a very important element here, which is how can we get global coordination? So you have to find the areas where countries can work together, and that countries is not just China and the US. Europe has to be part of it, and the developing world. I think another issue, which I didn't have time to talk about, AI should not be something that's done to the developing world, and they are just passively taking it. The developing world is most people who are alive today, who are going to be impacted by AI, are in the developing world, and they have zero voice on this. So we need to have a way of, as consortium and international organizations or some other movement that needs to have the developing country voice in the same way that we want worker voice in there.
Thank you. I think I'll collect maybe 3 questions so we can get as many.
And I'll try to be shorter.
So one question here, and one just behind.
Hi, Edmund Awad. Thank you for the great presentation and interesting discussion. About the point of the human adaptability to the jobs, I wonder what you think about the possibility of this form of human adaptability that, for example, especially in the services sectors, where, like, let's say you have restaurants that now would have, let's say, all robot servers, then maybe you will still have other restaurants that will have human servers that would charge higher or more expensive because they say we have a human touch, or maybe it's more ethical. And do you think about this is kind of something that is more like a possible that it could be a future? And what do you think of the consequences of that?
One person is behind.
Thank you. I come from Bell Labs Research Institute, so partially industry, but we do lots of research. And my question is about a trend now in the industry in AI, where there is a lot of talk about constitutional AI, which I think maybe you are familiar, mainly applies to large language models. How can we align the values of these models of the AI with people, and which values we align them with? So if you can comment also from this global viewpoint on this topic. Thanks.
And there's one more question just in front of you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jan, and I'm doing a PhD in artificial intelligence and creativity. I come from global big tech, and I'm also a skilled craftsperson in ceramics and glass. I'm interested in how the panel and the great presentation can mitigate some of the inflated claims of AI, because yes, I know, being in a tech background, and also how we can get more people involved and understand AI, because I think that's a key, ignorance is a key issue.
Should I get started? I'm sure the panel will also have inputs, but let me say a few words about each one of these excellent questions. Absolutely, I think there is going to be, in the future, value associated with the human interaction. I think it's going to be perhaps most in creative arts, that even if DALL-E version 17 can do as well as Van Gogh, something slightly less Van Gogh-y, but done by a true artist, may be more valuable. But I think in service work that can happen, but it's not going to be a big deal, because services are mass-produced and they are cost really matters. So that's why it's really important that what humans offer is not just the human stamp, but actually greater versatility, greater possibilities, and new services, new tasks, new things that humans can do with the means of technology. So for example, we can have much better healthcare if we empower nurses with technology. We can have a very, very different classroom if we empower educators rather than try to replace educators. By the way, where do you think the center of gravity is in terms of what we are investing in education and AI? It's 99% automation. Nobody is developing the really low-hanging fruit of let's give AI tools to educators so that they can understand what students need and they can adapt to it in real time. Zero investment in that. In terms of the alignment problem, absolutely, that's a very important thing, but it actually relates to this inflated things. I think alignment is key, and when I was talking about, doctors not understanding, that's an alignment. So there's a misalignment between AI models, but it's a much more mundane one. But when people in the Silicon Valley and in the US press talk about the alignment problem, it's the de-alignment problem. It's when superintelligence emerges, is it going to destroy us or is it going to be aligned with us? And again, I think that goes into this inflated thing. I think the much more mundane alignment of today's AI, who controls it? Because it's, at the end of the day, it's the preferences and the values of the people who control AI. Are we aligned with those? What social objectives? And then can we align our communication with these AI models so that we get reliable information? And then, I said exactly on this inflated point, I think the alignment problem is actually one of the best examples of that, and getting more voices is going to be very important. And I think the real big missing part is the developing world. So more than 5 billion people who are currently voiceless when it comes to AI. Thank you. I don't know whether...
Do we have any?
I mean, just briefly on the alignment problems, I think one challenging thing is that humans have different values, right? And if you look at the World Value Survey, and if you compare ChatGPT to responses around the world, you find, maybe not entirely unsurprisingly, that it most closely reflects the values of people in America and Europe. Some excellent work by your Henriks and collaborators show that, right? And I think the only way to really solve that problem is to have different competing systems, and that is best achieved through open source. So that's why I try to push the point about competition, and I agree with Daron. It's not alone in itself, but it is a really important part of the response, I think.
Thank you. I think we've got just 2 minutes left. 2 questions, quick, brief questions. Yeah, one in the back over there. And
hey, thanks very much. My question's about power concentration because of regulation. So there's a point made by Carl that talking about the risks of AI is just going to mean that we get regulation that's going to increase kind of the power of people who already have power, those corporations. I'm curious whether there's other forms of regulation that don't do that, and what other interventions we have, because from the talk, it was kind of the main thing that we should do. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm a researcher at the Center for Governance of AI, and my question is about the developing world. In terms of an institutional response, do you think this idea of pooling regional resources and setting up sort of regional institutions, including concentrated compute resources, training, is this a viable institutional response? And yeah, how do you see this kind of playing out? Thank you.
Two other excellent questions, and thanks for very much. Let me go in reverse order. I think we have to try many different things, but you cannot do it without developing the expertise and access in the developing world. I think some issues, the developing world voices can be heard, because even if they don't have expertise in technology, the consequences there will be felt. But going beyond that, you really need to have some expertise in the developing world. But I'm not optimistic that if we keep the current architecture and current sort of business model, which is very, very resource intensive, that the developing world would ever have a chance. Even a small scale, small to medium large language model requires at least $200 million. That's not going to be possible in the developing world. The amount of computation power, it's really mind-boggling. It's 1 trillion times more to train the Gemini than what we use to send people to the moon. So this capital-intensive path would definitely preclude the developing world. So that's why different architectures may be very interesting as well. And that also, again, intersects with the regulation question. I don't know the answer. Every regulation backfires to some extent, and some regulations do strengthen incumbents because they have the greater capacity to respond to them. So one very well-meaning regulation with the right values was the GDPR, of the General Data Protection Regulation of Europe. Great that we had it, but at the end of the day, it hasn't worked very well, and it has actually created an advantage for the larger corporations. On the other hand, we have a lot of experience in the post-war period with regulations that were especially using the nexus of civil society organization and the administrative state that have worked very differently. So the sort of what Ralph Nader led against car companies and the lack of safety of cars and the pharmaceuticals did not serve the purposes of General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, and it did not serve the purpose of the big pharma. But how we actually replicate or learn from that and do something better in the context of AI, I don't have the answer for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now reached the end of our time. I would like us to thank you again, Daron, for the wonderful presentation, all the thought-provoking answers, our wonderful panelists, and the general audience with all the ideas and thoughts and questions you asked.